I don't cover political things on this channel unless they're directly related to cars, and today, it's something related to cars. A fun fact about me is I actually study economics, but I am of course also an car enthusiast, so I know more about cars than the usual economic commentators, but more about economics than the usual motoring commentators, and this puts me in a very good position to discuss the effects of Trump's tariffs, what will have on the car industry. For this, I'll try to keep the video as non-political as possible, focusing on only what's actually happening in the car industry with tariffs, but of course it's almost impossible to make this topic not political given its nature. So I'll do my best at it, but no promises. Anyway, I'll also have a look at this from the perspective of car exporting nations, car importing nations, and the America. And I'll start with the America, but I'll get onto how it affects us in the civilized world too after I cover America. So, how will tariffs affect the car industry? First of all, European, Japanese, South Korean, Chinese cars, as well as cars manufactured in countries that don't have their own major car companies but are major popular destinations for outsourcing manufacturing, such as Mexico, South Africa and Brazil, will be more expensive in the American market. So for this, I'm going to bring up a diagram that everyone who's done economics will be extremely familiar with. The supply and demand graph. For those who don't know, it's pretty simple. This isn't any advanced economic theory, but the kind of stuff you'd do in first year. Actually, I did it in grade 11 economics classes, so it'll be some pretty basic stuff. And I'll get into some specifics about the car industry and its unique traits so that I can talk about that the economics commentators don't always mention, because cars aren't their field of expertise. But I'll start with a bit of basic economic theory. Let's say that you're a farmer and you sell apples. You have two paddocks, one of which is really good for growing apples, but the other one, it's not so good. The soil's less fertile and the terrain's rough, and that means that it's more difficult to work in. So let's say apples, they cost $1. If you put it on the market, they'll sell for $1. Your good field, that can produce apples at a price of 70 cents because it's really good, it's really fertile, you can drive machinery through it, it's a perfect field. But the bad field, it can only do a price of $1.30. So you decide to either leave that field empty or farm something else there. Then suddenly, the price of apples on the open market increases to $2. Now the other field would be profitable for producing apples. So you produce more apples because the price is higher. This is why the supply curve slopes up. In a perfectly competitive market, sellers will supply more when the price goes up. The further to the right you are along this curve, the more is supplied. That's why the x-axis, which is the axis that goes from side to side, is the quantity that's in the market. The y-axis, the one that goes up and down, is the price. The higher the price, the higher up on the graph you are. So a point that's low down and all the way to the right means a whole lot of something is supplied and it's cheap. A point high and to the left means not much is supplied and it's expensive. So now look at the demand curve. It slopes downward. Think of it this way. You want to buy apples. You go to the shop and they cost $7. You say, oh yeah, I'd rather not do that actually. So you don't demand any apples at a price of $7. Very few people would pay $7 for an apple, so the demand is low. Let's say that you go back later and they're now selling for $2. Well, you're willing to pay $2 for an apple, so you buy one. Or maybe you go there and they're $1. You're planning to buy some oranges as well, but since the price of apples are so cheap, you decide to buy even more apples. That's why the demand curve slopes downward. So let's put the two lines together. Now you get this. They meet at a point. This is called the equilibrium point. In a perfectly competitive market, it's the price of a good and the amount of it that's sold, the quantity. Producers can't produce any more of the good profitably, and consumers aren't willing to pay any more than this point. Okay, got that? Good. Let's introduce trade now. So now you've got this horizontal line running across below the equilibrium point. The supply curve is now representing specifically domestic supply, so this is the US domestic market for cars now. that we're looking at on this graph. The black line is the global supply of cars, the flat line underneath that. The US is a very big economy, so for the real market, this curve would actually be slightly upward sloping since the US is somewhat of a price maker, but it would still be pretty flat or elastic as we call it, because there's a whole rest of the world with its prices, so it's not the sole price maker. So we'll represent this as a flat line, so US demand won't set prices by as much, but what you're seeing here is a simplification for demonstration purposes of economic theory related to current events and its effect on global car markets. So what we have here is a world price that's lower than the domestic equilibrium price. That means some cars are imported instead of built domestically. That's the amount between Q domestic and Q total across the bottom there. The open markets to imports mean that the prices overall are lower and the amount of cars purchased is higher. Just over half the cars on US roads are made in the US, so I've drawn this graph so that a little over half the cars sold are domestic production. So you can see the advantages and disadvantages of foreign trade. It drops prices, but you can get cheap cars, but some local producers are priced out of the market. So let's help out our car producers by adding a tariff. So what does that look like? The amount of cars sold in total is reduced since the equilibrium price is higher, and that's represented by the point Q new total. Tariffs also raise a bit of government revenue, and that's represented by the small section above the imported cars between the world price and tariff lines. Calculating tariff revenue on a supply and demand graph, by the way, has the same formula as the area of a rectangle. The red squiggly line there is the reduction in total cars sold, but the good news, since there's higher price in the domestic market, the car makers supply more cars. Just like the apple farmer example before, higher price, more supply. So this green squiggly line represents the increase in domestic production from the tariff. The end result, sellers make more money and the buyers have to pay more money whilst foreign competition loses sales. This is a simple tariff situation, and there's advantages and disadvantages to doing this. If you work for a car company, you'd probably like this. If you work as a car dealership, you'd probably hate this. A lot of economists, mainstream economists, will give lots of arguments for why tariffs are a bad idea, and if you want to know more about just the economic theory on its own, I'd recommend looking up the theory of comparative advantage to know more. But this isn't a simple explanation of basic economics of tariffs. You can go anywhere for that. This is about specifically Trump's tariffs and their effects on the car industry. This is where Trump's tariffs begin to look a whole lot more stupid. Because he's not just tariffing cars, this is where the problem is. He's tariffing literally everything from every country, even ones that aren't countries and don't have any population for some reason. And this is a huge mistake because he's tariffing intermediate goods as well. This includes his tariffs on steel and aluminium. He's putting huge tariffs on Taiwan, which produces semiconductors. If a car is made in the US and it's made of steel or aluminium, it'll be more expensive. One of the big things that the European car industry has struggled with recently is the cost of semiconductors. That's a big factor in why European cars have increased a lot in price, and even had to remove some features such as rain sensing wipers in some cases. Semiconductors being more expensive in the US means that it'll be more expensive to produce cars in the US. Then of course, since prices will be going up all across the US economy, workers will be demanding higher nominal wages since their real wages are declining. Then there's also other completed components. I was doing a bit of research into a video I'm making about steer-by-wire tech, and I noticed the Tesla Cybertruck steer-by-wire system includes components from ZF and Bosch, and the front suspension is from Bilstein. It's all German on the inside, just like Musk's new political ideology. So all of this will be tariffed, and that'll make the Cybertruck more expensive. But it's not just the Cybertruck, it's every car from America because cars use foreign-made components. So essentially, the way you would represent this is the whole supply curve shifting to the left. Since the cost of production is higher, firms produce less of the same good at any given price. So what happens here? The tariff raises prices to the same new level, but since the cost of production is also increased, domestic production also falls. Cars get more expensive, businesses make less money, and imports stay the same. Congratulations, you've just made the country poorer. Putting tariffs on intermediate goods is a really poor economic decision. Tariffs in general are questionable, but these ones in particular are especially stupid and will cost America bigly, as their leader would say. Of course, this graph is a stylization, and to calculate the exact costs of tariffing both intermediate and final goods, you'd need to do an analysis of the supply chain of all American-made cars, but basic economic theory dictates that the total effect would be in this general direction. I can't give you a number specifically how much would the increase in costs for domestic production lead to an increase in US-made cars big enough to counteract the entire tariff. Possibly not, but some of the countries where raw materials are being sourced from are given much bigger tariffs than vehicle exporting nations. Some are given small tariffs though. It's very variable by country, but the basic effect of increasing the price of American-made vehicles would apply regardless. You increase the cost of inputs, well, the output's going to cost more. That's a fairly logical conclusion to come to from that. But yeah, to find the specific amounts that it increase the cost of American vehicles, you would need to do a more deep supply chain analysis. For a more recent example of tariffs on intermediate goods, look at the Sri Lankan economic crisis. The Sri Lankan government was already into a debt crisis, and the country had high foreign imports. One of the biggest imports was fertilizer. The government decided, alright, well, let's ban the import of synthetic fertilizers, which would have the effect of reducing total imports. Agriculture then very quickly collapsed in Sri Lanka, and the economy collapsed, leading to widespread civil unrest. Congratulations, you've made the country poorer. Trump is doing tariffs rather than an outright ban, and the US is a much bigger economy, so the tariffs won't cause an overnight economic collapse like in Sri Lanka, but they will cost the US economy significantly. But let's look over at Europe to see how this will affect the civilized world and most of this channel's audience. Given all these tariffs, heaps of goods that were supposed to be shipped to America now won't be shipped to America, and this means they'll end up on European shelves. And this means lower prices for all sorts of things, including cars. But it also means that European cars will be cheaper to produce. Remember how I said the flat world price line was a bit of a simplification just to make it easy to explain, but basic economic theory still applies? Well, the US tariffs will have an effect on world prices, and that's more relevant to the rest of the world's markets. The US is buying less foreign intermediate goods and raw materials such as semiconductors, machinery, and car components, and that means that European car manufacturers can buy these for much less. This means that they can produce cars for less money, and this is especially good news for Renault and VW, who are both on the move when it comes to making affordable electric vehicles. The new Renault 5 is out and everyone loves it, and only costs 25,000 euros. That's the same price as the Chinese BYD Dolphin, but the R5 comes with multi-link rear suspension, not whatever the fuck this is on the rear of the BYD. VW plans to have their new ID.1 costing just 20,000 euros, and cheaper semiconductors from Taiwan and cheaper steel and lithium from Australia will make hitting this target much easier for the German manufacturer that's had so much trouble with electric vehicles recently. The same goes for Stellantis, who will find the 23,000 euro Citroën EC3 to be a little bit more profitable now. Manufacturers will also be making their cars more specifically for the European market instead of the massive, ostentatious designs which companies such as BMW claimed were for the American market's tastes. The European cars will be designed more towards European tastes, improving the styling of European cars. Since American cars will be more expensive to make though, European exports of cars to America won't fall by quite as much as some would expect though. So don't expect that European cars will be entirely de-Americaned in their styling. They'll still factor in the US market somewhat. Japan and South Korea will see an almost identical effect to what Europe sees, so if you want to know what will happen there, just rewatch this section of the video 3 times. But what about... China. Since China, like the European Union, is a car exporting nation, it seems like it's in the same boat. But it's actually in quite a different situation. Chinese cars have had tariffs on them for a long time, and big tariffs from the US, and also the EU, but the US has the bigger ones, 100% to be exact. So BYD and other big Chinese brands have nearly no market share in the US. So they'll get a little cheaper from lower global commodity and intermediate manufactured good prices, but it won't have the oversupply effect that Europe has with all the cars it would have sent to America. So European cars will get more relatively cheaper than Chinese cars from these. But with a tougher competition from Europe in the European domestic market, perhaps the growth of Chinese cars in Europe might slow down. But Europeans could lose further market share in China as the Chinese EV industry develops. Whilst Chinese EVs are a very cheap option, many buyers would prefer not to buy a BYD, as they're still cautious about Chinese cars. Whilst it's true that BYD has made a great leap forward in their level of quality and sophistication over the years, Europeans, among others, would need a major shift in motoring culture, perhaps a whole cultural revolution of sorts, if they were to really accept Chinese cars on their roads. But for many buyers, BYD simply present too many red flags, whilst to some other buyers they see a BYD and although it's a little bit different to what they're used to, they'll argue that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. Whether the European buyers will reorient themselves towards China remains to be seen. Finally, what about car importing nations? There's two types of car importing nations. There's Canada and there's the rest of the world. Canada is unique because their car regulations are in line with the US regulations. This means that the cars made in Europe or Mexico for the US market will no longer be exported to the US and can easily be exported to Canada instead. If they have analog instrumentation, they will require this to be replaced with metric units. If they have digital instrumentation, no changes are necessary as this can change over with just software. This means that some cars in Canada might suddenly get a whole lot cheaper, but American-made cars, which are a large portion of the Canadian market, may become more expensive due to the reasons mentioned earlier. So American cars will lose market share in Canada. And also there's the boycott effect. Canadians are really annoyed with America at the moment, so they'll be less likely to want an American car. For the rest of the world, such as in my country of Australia, where all cars are imported, we'll probably see cheaper cars. Australians do not buy many American-made cars, and this is the case for most car importing nations. European, Japanese and South Korean cars will be cheaper, Chinese cars will be about the same, and not much else will happen. But what do you think of the tariffs and their effects on the global car industry? Write your thoughts in the comments.